Okay, so this is a demonstration video showing how to mount some models onto a Denar articulator using a FACEBO registration. In this demonstration, we're going to mount the models together, the upper and lower models, in ICP. So this is an ICP record, so when the teeth are in maximum interdigitation. So this is a simple silicone bite in between the upper and lower teeth. So you can see the occlusal surfaces of the lower teeth here. If we have a very positive ICP position, we don't need a bite registration necessarily. In fact, it can even make mounting the models more difficult because we can't get the contacts as closely as we can just as between the models because we've got the silicone interfering. Anyway, if we have a silicone registration like this one, the first thing we do in the lab is take a scalpel and we remove anything that could cause an interference. So where the silicones come off the occlusal surfaces of the teeth and here up the palatal aspects of the teeth, you can imagine that that could stop the teeth, the models seating into the registration correctly. So we want to remove as much as possible so we can see the cusp tips locating right down into the silicone material. Then we take our models that are going to be mounted and we put some kind of location onto the base of the model so that if it needs to be removed from the plasterwork, we can reposition it back into the same place. Here I'm just making some chamfers on the sides of the models, which allow the model to be located back into the plaster. Some people use a burr and cut little grooves in, crosses, whatever it is. It doesn't really matter as long as there's something to allow the model to be repositioned if it comes off and needs to be placed back on. And we do the same thing, of course, for the lower model. So here you can see that's having chamfers cut onto the edges just as we did for the upper. Now we're going to use a FACEBO registration to mount the upper model onto the articulator. So here we have the FACEBO registration. There's the silicone that's been used to locate the bite fork onto the occlusal surfaces of the upper teeth. So again, we use a scalpel, remove as much material as we can to just leave the indentations made by the cusp tips in the silicone material so that when we position that model down onto the bite registration, we can see that the model's locating fully into those indentations. Anything that comes in between the teeth, like this bit here, that's likely to stop the model locating fully. So you can imagine anything that's going incidentally, even down into the fissures of the teeth. Remember that the silicone material may displace soft tissues as well. So we want to make sure that wherever it's contacted the gingiva around the teeth, that's removed, because the gingiva in the mouth can be compressed, but on the model, of course, particularly when made out of diastone, it can't. Then we need to have a look at the occlusal surfaces of the model. So any small air blows, like we can see air blows in the impression material, like we can see here, which have resulted in a little pimple in one of the fissures, we need to remove because that could stop the model seating down into the FACEBO registration correctly, and of course the ICP record that we're going to use to locate the lower model to this upper model in the next stage. So we check that that fits in passively, and then we take our articulator. This is the standard customizable incisal guidance table that's on the front of the articulator, the white bit at the bottom. This is the incisal pin. We set that to 0 to start with. This is the mounting plate. So these are disposable mounting plates, or we can reuse them if they're better quality ones with the metal threads in them. But these go onto the articulator and the plasterwork gets connected to these removable mounting plates to allow the models to be taken off the articulator and replaced readily. So there's the upper one in place. We remove the standard incisal table here, just turn the screw quarter of a turn, loosens it, comes off, and we put the mounting jig in. So this is just a gadget that allows us to locate the FACEBO transfer jig in the correct position. And these now are available for most types of articulator and facebow combinations. So if you have a Denar facebow and an articulator made by somebody else, there's usually a transfer jig that's been made to enable them to be used together. Here we've got Denar and Denar, so all is simple. So the transfer jig gets located into the front of the articulator like so. Little positive connection because it's D-shaped and there's a little circlet to get it to sit in the right position. Then we just tighten it up with a screw and that keeps it nice and firm. And then the model can be gently placed onto the facebow registration. Remember, if this gets distorted or moved, if those screws numbers 1 and 2 are loose and everything moves, the whole thing's a waste of time. So we need to make sure that we're careful with this as we're doing it. Sometimes we put a support underneath the bite fork to make sure that the weight of the model and the plaster isn't going to move the bite fork at all. And then we take some essentially plaster of Paris. Sometimes we put some additives in there, or buy a special plaster which has a lower expansion on setting, and we mix that up to a nice consistency so there's no lumps or bumps, no lumps in it of dried material, and so that it's nice and soft as we close the articulator down. Popping a bit there in the mounting plate like so, and then supporting the model and the facebow bite fork, we can close the articulator down, and with that nice soft plaster material, hopefully there's very little resistance, and we can make sure that the incisal pin of the articulator is fully seated. Just hold it while everything moves into its final resting position, and then essentially we leave it alone until the plaster started to firm up. And once it's firmed up, we can just fill in the gaps in between the model and the mounting plate, again as gently as possible, trying not to move anything at all, move the model in the silicone or the bite fork about on the articulator. We don't have to mess about with it too much. Some people do, they'll go around and trim the plaster work until it's all nice and smooth, or we can do it using this method where we just let the material set and then we can trim it on the model trimmer afterwards. So that's done its job now. That's the sole purpose of the facebow registration, to get that model, that first model, mounted in the correct position on the articulator in relation to those condyles. The standard incisal table can go back on and into position. Tighten that up. Again, a mounting plate for the lower, that locates into position, and we screw it on. A bit of waste plaster there, just get rid of that. And then essentially we repeat the procedure with the articulator upside down and mount the lower model. So here you can see I've got the silicone ICP record sitting passively. We have to make sure it sits passively on the lower model to start with, independently check it on the upper model, and then we can pop the two together. So everything's related in ICP. Turn the whole lot upside down, close the articulator, and then we're going to fill that gap with plaster just like we did for the upper model. So another mix of plaster, building it up, some on the mounting plate again, close it down, let it set, and then we'll fill that gap just once it's started to firm up a little. Okay, and then once that's done, we can leave the whole thing to set until the plaster's good and hard, and make sure that it's not going to break as we try and remove everything. So this is 10-15 minutes later or so. Pop the mounting plates off, and now we're just going to tidy up the plaster work. So we've done the job really, now we're just making it look pretty and presentable. So we can take the models, and using the model trimmer just trim the excess plaster off all the way around, using the side of the model as a guide and the side of the mounting plate, and then they can go back on. As I say, some people will put the plaster on the models on the articulator and spend the time doing this work on the articulator to save having to grind on the model trimmer. So this allows a nice smooth surface to be achieved, and I suppose more importantly really you can see the joint between the model and the plaster, so that if we're taking the model off that plaster mounting and then we want to put it back on, we can see that it seats down nice and accurately once we've repositioned the model. And then repeat that for the lower, and then everything can go back onto the articulator, and we've got the models mounted not only in relation to each other correctly in ICP, but also at the correct distance from that condyle, because we've used a face bow registration. Now remember that face bow registration, its primary purpose is to get that distance between the models and the condyle. It also ensures that we get the incisal plane angle correct, so that when we're looking at the models from the front, we're seeing that the incisal edges are parallel to the bench top, if they would have been when the patient's standing, or we've got the correct angle anyway. Okie dokie, that's it.